Now thank we all our God with heart and hand and voices, who wondrous things has done, in whom his world rejoices, who from our mother's arms hath blessed us on our way with countless gifts of love, and still is ours today. All praise and thanks to God the Father now be given, the Son and him who reigns with them in highest heaven, the one eternal God, whom earth and heaven adore. For thus it was as now, and shall be evermore.
Welcome to the Beau Show. This week we celebrate Thanksgiving in America, which is both historically and culturally significant, as it represents one of our country's longest standing traditions. As I do with many of my shows, I like to provide a little history so that we have a better understanding of why we celebrate various traditions and holidays. Traditions keep our history robust and keep younger generations educated on why we are Americans. I took a look at history.com to research this, which is where most of the forthcoming information is sourced. In 1620, the Mayflower ship set sail from Plymouth, England, with people on board attempting to be able to practice their religious faiths freely. These religious separatists, along with others who were lured by promise, set out for the New World and landed in Cape Cod and eventually down to the Massachusetts Bay, where they began to establish a village in Plymouth and became known as pilgrims. Throughout their first brutal winter, they experienced bouts of infectious disease, probably not unlike the one we just experienced recently. Only half of those who came across the ocean survived to make it ashore in that first spring. They were greeted by a member of the Abenaki tribe, who greeted them in English. Several days later, he returned with Squanto, a member of the Pawtuxet tribe, who had been captured by an English sea captain and sold into slavery, but managed to escape to London and return back to America. Squanto taught the pilgrims how to cultivate corn, extract sap from maple trees, catch fish, and avoid poisonous plants. He also helped the settlers forge an alliance with the Wampanoag tribe, a shining example of lasting peace and harmony between the European settlers and Native Americans. In November of 1621, after the first successful corn harvest, Governor William Bradford organized a celebratory feast, inviting some of their Native American allies for this festival, which lasted 3 days. And while we don't know entirely what was on the menu, we do have some accounts by writers of that experience, who described eating fowl and venison. This is why Thanksgiving is always associated with turkey. Also, because of their location in New England, they spoke of an abundance of lobster and mussels and oysters, which could have been on the menu that day. Onions, beans, carrots, lettuce, and other veggies were probably served, and corn as well, but not the way that we eat it now. It was likely mashed into a porridge or cornmeal, and cranberries, which are also associated with our modern feasts, would have been abundant at the time, but not perhaps in the tart sauces that we use today, because the sugar that came over on the Mayflower was completely depleted. Both pilgrims and Indians would have consumed pumpkins and other squash, but once again, without sugar and without a baking oven, this would not have made for pumpkin pie. They probably mixed it with honey and milk to make some sort of a custard. As for the composition of the people, Indians would have outnumbered the colonists by about 2 to 1, at least, since so few of the Mayflower settlers survived that first winter. Pilgrim chronicler Edward Winslow wrote, quote, "Amongst other recreations, we exercised our arms, many of the Indians coming amongst us, and amongst the rest their great king Massasoit, with some 90 men, whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted, and they went out and killed 5 deer, which they brought to the plantation, and bestowed on our governor, and upon the captain and others. And although it be not always so plentiful, as it was at this time with us, yet by the goodness of God, we are so far from want, that we often wish you partakers of our plenty." Unquote. I find it worth mentioning that they were grateful for this feast, considering the hardship of that first winter. This is why they gave thanks. The attitude of gratitude came from hardship and toil. But remember why these pilgrims came. They were religious outcasts or separatists. They weren't allowed to worship as they wished, and they saw promise in this new world long before Hamilton and Jefferson and Washington stepped foot on American soil. But the rudiments and the promise of America were all there. A hope for a better life, religious freedom, a foreign people with whom they could feast together and learn about one another, trading and learning how to work the land. The Pilgrims marked their second Thanksgiving feast in November of 1623 after a season of drought. So Governor Bradford called for a religious fast. This practice of fasting and Thanksgiving became common and even annual at other New England villages. During the American Revolution, days of Thanksgiving were designated by the Continental Congress. And in 1789, George Washington made the very first Thanksgiving proclamation by the new government. He proclaimed gratitude for the end of the revolution against Britain, as well as the ratification of the Constitution. New York in 1817 was the first state to adopt a Thanksgiving holiday. In 1827, Sarah Hale, author of such nursery rhymes as Mary Had a Little Lamb, launched a campaign to make Thanksgiving a national holiday. Due to her numerous letters to politicians, she became known as the Mother of Thanksgiving. In 1863, during the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln finally heeded her request in a proclamation entreating all Americans to ask God to commend to his tender care all those who have become widows, orphans, mourners, or sufferers in the lamentable civil strife, and to heal the wounds of the nation. He scheduled Thanksgiving for the final Thursday of November, which is how it was celebrated until 1939, when FDR moved the holiday up a week to spur retail sales during the Great Depression. This was met with resistance, so he moved the holiday back to the fourth Thursday in November. The History Channel notes that our modern-day celebration of Thanksgiving has lost much of its religious connotation in many American households. It now centers on this epic meal, and I think it's worth noting that it has lost this religious association as the secularization of America has proceeded. We see the same thing around Easter. It's just associated now with the bunny. And Christmas, that's branded by Santa Claus and Douglas firs. While America afforded us all the right to practice religion, or no religion at all, I think it is important to remember the Plymouth settlers and their religious persecution and eventual freedom. When you read the texts and writings of settlers and, of course, of our founders, there was a deep reverence for God himself and how they viewed this bountiful new nation. They saw it as a godsend. They were thankful to even be alive. As families gather this Thanksgiving, which many were unable to do last year, I think we should reset our thoughts back on those original pilgrims who also had to battle scurvy and other infectious diseases in the New World. And they gave thanks, and they also invited foreign people to their table. Much of the Judeo-Christian values that our country was founded upon came from these early settlers' religious practices. Quakers, Puritans, Catholics, they all wanted to be able to practice their faith without interference. Europe had seen a great deal of strife when it came to religious differences, but America could offer a place where differences wouldn't come to blows. Parades, of course, were also mixed into the Thanksgiving tradition. Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade has been a tradition since 1924. The presidential pardon of turkeys also has become intertwined in this tradition. There's been some debate as to whether that Plymouth celebration was the true first Thanksgiving, as there were other similar celebrations in 1565 and in 1619. But in both cases, they made proclamations of thanks to Almighty God. There's the significant thread that ties them all together. In more modern times, however, and in an era of revisionist history, some protest Thanksgiving, calling it a day of mourning for Native Americans. While the idea of celebrating after a fall harvest is not specific to our culture or land, it is significant that America's Thanksgiving represented a spirit of hope and promise in a new world. Furthermore, in this new country, which wasn't even a country at that point, there was a sense of freedom that they had never experienced before, which is clearly the basis for the eventual Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. It wouldn't be for another 150 years that these colonials figured out that they had enough of being ruled by King George. So this American celebration happened under very unique circumstances. And without it, without other religious separatists coming over to find their own freedom and journey, we wouldn't have the eventual United States of America. And frankly, world history hinges upon that. Many of our ancestors can be traced back to that Mayflower and other ships that came over. And their desire to plot their own course is just the same as those who are born in this country today. Granted, we have far more advances in medicine and technology that make our lives longer and more comfortable. While we may have to deal with COVID, we know so much more about infectious disease. We are very, very lucky in that regard. But I still want to focus on the spirit of those pilgrims, what they'd been through, and what they hoped new American life would behold. I have to wonder about those 50 or so souls that survived winter and summer to enjoy that November feast. I also think about them conversing with Squanto and these indigenous tribes who didn't speak their language. In many ways, I think this may have set the precedent for American charity and friendship. Yes, conflict with natives was not always savory, but by all accounts, this interaction between the Plymouth settlers and the Wampanoag tribe is significant. It was a mutual respect and a mutual learning experience. And perhaps that amicability is something that we all can learn from as we sit down at the Thanksgiving table this week. We are more worried now about who might have a better Thanksgiving photo for Instagram than we do about who is around us and what is around us and what we can be grateful for. In my estimation, there should be a renewal of the American promise, a celebration of optimism, a kindred spirit, and a reminder of what we came from and who we are today. I think that is critical in our education and understanding. I remember dressing up as either a pilgrim or an Indian in elementary school, but now you can't do that anymore because it's considered offensive cultural appropriation. What was once a celebration to bring us together is now an opportunity to divide us. And I think that's catastrophic. For instance, when I learn the word cheers in another language, I do it around company that may speak that language. Maybe it's na zdrowie around the Polish, or prost around my German friends, or salud for my Latino friends. I am not appropriating anything. I'm finding a common bond and learning something about them. Nowadays, we have people in groups that seek to take apart our history so that they can find offense rather than gratitude and togetherness. I find that antithetical to the American promise. That's what Mao would do. That's a commie tactic. Don't you think that sometimes we look today for what separates us more than what binds us together? These colonial settlers, for all of their differences and uniqueness, were enthralled by the idea of a better place where they could worship freely. And at the end of the day, people want to be left alone to pursue their own path. You do you and I do me. But we can still be thankful for what we have. And we can do that in a spirit of togetherness. I don't think we need to add to the strife and division. Those early settlers who didn't even yet have a notion of a constitutional republic had every vision that every American has ever had. It was something England couldn't provide to them. And whether they knew it or not, they began to establish a sense of equality that they hadn't experienced before. And that is what laid the groundwork for the concept of America and the sublime tenets that we have today. Not that every person is blessed with the same amount of talent equally, but that every person has an equal chance to make life their own. Turkey and pumpkin pie alone do not signify or accomplish that. But they should remind us that times can be hard. Resources can be scarce. Life can be grim and brutal. But from all that chaos comes order and promise. America should not be looked back on as some repressive, awful place. Without it, the world is never the same. We have a tendency in modern times to look at America as a source of evil or hatred, and that's not how or why this country was founded. In fact, we should be eternally grateful that the colonists came here and created this divine experiment, because if it weren't for them and their grand ideas, we couldn't live in the country that we have today. James Faust wrote, quote, "The thankful heart opens our eyes to a multitude of blessings that continually surround us," unquote. People have taken our major holidays like Thanksgiving, July 4th, and Columbus Day and made them sources of division rather than a celebration. They have sought out a point of contention to refuse to celebrate the day rather than unite behind it. And that type of postmodernism is a threat to the fabric of our spirit. It's like a cancer eating us from within. The message of Thanksgiving is a grateful heart, but it requires an action, giving thanks. There's a certain state a person is in when they are quiet and contemplating such a thing. It's hard for us to remove all of our distractions, especially from our cell phones. But let this week be a reminder of all the good from this country. Unfortunately, this may be the most expensive Thanksgiving we have ever had due to inflation and the scarcity of goods. But it doesn't come close to what those original pilgrims had to face after a brutal year. I can understand why they felt grateful after all that had happened. And yet still, they celebrated with a group of people very different from them and made peace. Nowadays, we look at Thanksgiving as that holiday where we might have to see people that we want to avoid. This is what complacency can do. It breeds contempt for the things that you should be grateful for. I feel like every year around this time, we should be reminded of what those pilgrims did. I mean, sure, it's fun to turn on the TV and watch the Macy's parade or Thanksgiving Day football. But this is a very important tradition that we are celebrating. People in other parts of the world do not have this luxury. Maintaining this tradition is part of our culture, which is rooted in faith, even though many people are trying to undo or remove these traditions. I'm sure you have traditions of your own at your home. And for those who can't see family this year or are more isolated, Friendsgiving is a great way to connect these bonds. Never take freedom to assemble for granted. We already saw that it was tested last year. Don't think that it's just something you can presume. Every day presents a new opportunity. With whatever has happened in our lives, especially the unfortunate things, there is still room to be grateful. Let's stay humble, grateful, and kind. Have a blessed Thanksgiving. I'm Beau, and that's the show.